My world began where the city's glitter ended. I lived in the shadow of the Finch Tower, a skyscraper that pierced the clouds, a needle of glass and steel stitching the sky to the earth. Down below, in the tangled streets of the Warren, we saw it as a different kind of sky, a heaven we could never enter. My name is Leo, and my kingdom wasn't made of glass, but of discarded things. It was a kingdom of rust and wire, of cracked casings and forgotten gears. Other kids played with balls or video games. I played with the bones of broken machines. I'd find an old radio, its voice long dead, and spend hours tracing its circuits, my small fingers following the pathways like a map to a lost world. To me, it wasn't trash. It was a puzzle, a story. I could feel the secret life in these objects, the hum of a capacitor still holding a faint charge, the perfect, satisfying click of a switch that still worked. My hands were always stained with grease and dirt, a roadmap of my explorations. My mother would sigh, scrubbing at my knuckles until they were raw. She saw junk. I saw potential. I saw the ghost in the machine. From our tiny apartment window, the Finch Tower was a constant, silent presence. It hummed with a power I could only imagine. It was a machine itself, the biggest, most complex machine I had ever seen. I would watch the lights flicker on at dusk, floor by floor, a slow cascade of gold. I imagined the veins of wire running through its concrete bones, the elevators like blood cells shooting through its arteries, the central air conditioning its steady, rhythmic breath. I didn't dream of the wealth inside. I didn't care about the fancy suits or the billion-dollar deals I heard people whispering about. I dreamt of its heart, the boiler room, the server farms, the elevator control systems. I wanted to understand its language, to hear its story. The kids in the neighborhood called me junk boy. They didn't understand why I'd rather have a busted toaster than a new pair of sneakers. They saw a quiet, skinny kid covered in grime. They didn't see the blueprints taking shape in my mind, the schematics I could almost taste. I was learning a language no one around me spoke, the language of logic, of cause and effect, of mechanics and electricity. And every lesson, every small victory in my scrapyard kingdom made me stare up at that tower with a deeper longing. It was the ultimate test, the final exam I knew I would one day have to face. That building held more than just offices. It held the man who built it all, Mr. Alistair Finch. We'd see his helicopter land on the roof some evenings, a dragonfly of black metal against the sunset. They said he was a genius, a man who could bend technology to his will. They said he was richer than a king and just as ruthless. To the world he was a legend. To the people in the Warren he was a myth, as distant and unreal as the stars. He lived in the sky and we lived on the ground, a gap too wide to cross. But I knew something about machines. They don't care if you're rich or poor. They don't care about your suit or the dirt under your fingernails. They only care about one thing, whether or not you understand them. I felt a strange connection to this man I'd never met, a shared passion across an impossible divide. He built machines. I resurrected them. We were speaking the same language, just in different worlds. I remember finding an old, discarded security panel one day. Its circuits were fried, the board blackened by a surge. I spent a week carefully cleaning it, soldering new connections with a tool I'd made from a clothespin and a nail. On the 7th day, I hooked it up to a small battery. A single green light blinked to life. It was a triumphant moment, a tiny beacon in my world of rust. I held a piece of a system, a fraction of the technology that made the Finch Tower possible. I was holding a key, even if I didn't know what lock it would open. I looked up at the tower, its peak lost in the afternoon haze, and felt a pull, a sense of destiny I couldn't explain. He lived at the very top of that world, a king in his castle. And he had no idea that his entire empire depended on the very things, and the very people, he had long since discarded. Alistair Finch's world was filtered through 3 inches of soundproof, bulletproof glass. From his penthouse office on the 80th floor, the city below wasn't a place of people but a data set. It was a sprawling circuit board of traffic patterns, energy consumption and market fluctuations. He didn't see faces, he saw metrics. He didn't hear voices, he heard noise. People were variables, assets or liabilities, instruments to be conducted or obstacles to be removed. He valued precision, efficiency and absolute control. Emotions were a design flaw in the human machine, a bug he had long since patched in himself. His kingdom wasn't built of scraps. It was built of code, of contracts, and of a cold, hard certainty that he was always the smartest man in the room. His mornings were ruthlessly optimized. A 5 a.m. workout in his private gym, a nutrient-optimized smoothie delivered by a silent housekeeper, and then hours of conquering markets before the rest of the world had even had its coffee. He moved through his life with a predatory grace, his tailored suits a kind of urban camouflage. He despised anything that wasted his time, small talk, traffic, incompetence, especially incompetence. He believed that any problem could be solved with enough money or enough processing power, usually both. His company, Finch Automations, was a reflection of his soul. It created proprietary closed-loop systems, secure, seamless, and utterly impenetrable. He sold control to the highest bidders, building gilded cages for the world's elite. His personal elevator was the crown jewel of this philosophy. It wasn't just a lift, it was a vault. It ran on a completely independent encrypted network. It responded only to his biometric signature. It didn't have buttons for other floors. It went from his penthouse to the boardroom to his private garage, and nowhere else. It was his sanctuary, his personal transit tube through a world he couldn't be bothered to interact with. Inside its silent, polished chrome walls, he was utterly alone, and that was exactly how he liked it. He saw the people on the streets below as relics of an outdated system. They were messy, unpredictable, and inefficient. He saw the rundown neighborhood of the Warren from his window, not as a community of families, but as a blight, an undeveloped asset, a patch of urban decay that offended his sense of order. The idea that a mind capable of innovation could exist down there was, to him, a statistical impossibility. On this particular day, a storm was brewing, not just in the sky, but in the markets. A rival corporation was attempting a hostile takeover, a move that was both audacious and, to Alistair, deeply insulting. He was scheduled for a 4 p.m. call, a digital showdown with his board that would crush the opposition and secure his reign for another decade. He paced his office, the city a mere backdrop to his irritation. His personal assistant, a nervous young man named Peterson, had made a mistake on a slide deck. A tiny, insignificant typo, but to Alistair, it was a crack in the foundation of reality. He dressed Peterson down with surgical precision, his words cold and sharp, leaving the young man pale and trembling. He didn't shout. He didn't need to. His disappointment was a weapon far more effective than rage. He despised the approaching storm. It was an inconvenience, an untamed, chaotic variable that he couldn't control. The sky was turning a bruised purple, and the wind was beginning to howl around the corners of his glass fortress. It was messy. It was imperfect. He checked his watch. 3:45 p.m. Time to descend to the secure boardroom on the 60th floor. He gathered his tablet, his mind already 3 steps ahead, running simulations of the meeting. He wouldn't just win, he would annihilate. He walked towards the elevator, the polished marble floor reflecting his solitary figure. He was the master of his universe, a king in a tower of his own making, completely sealed off from the messy, chaotic world below. He believed his systems were infallible, perfect, unbreakable. He placed his thumb on the biometric scanner, and the chrome doors slid open with a whisper. He was stepping into his sanctuary, but he was really stepping into a trap of his own design. The storm didn't just arrive. It fell upon the city like a judgment. The sky, which had been a nervous shade of grey, was suddenly ripped open. The first crack of thunder wasn't a distant rumble. It was a physical blow, a deafening crack that seemed to shake the Finch Tower to its very foundations. Down in the Warren, the world turned to a frantic blur of motion. Shopkeepers wrestled with awnings that bucked and snapped in the wind. People ran for cover, heads down, as the first fat, heavy drops of rain began to fall, hitting the pavement with audible splats. The air grew thick and heavy, charged with the electric smell of ozone. I was in my kingdom, my back-alley workshop, when the sky broke. I felt the pressure change in my ears before I even heard the thunder. I knew this wasn't a normal summer shower. This was different. This was violent. My first thought wasn't for myself, but for my treasures. A delicate motherboard I had salvaged, a set of gears I had painstakingly aligned, a small motor I had just coaxed back to life. I worked frantically, covering them with a ripped piece of tarp, weighing down the corners with bricks. The wind howled through the alley, a mournful, angry sound, kicking up dust and debris. It felt personal, like the sky was trying to tear my fragile world apart. I could see the Finch Tower, its top floors already swallowed by the dark, churning clouds. The rain came down in sheets, a solid wall of water that blurred the world into a grey watercolour painting. Up on the 80th floor, Alistair Finch barely registered the fury of the storm beyond his annoyance. To him it was just pathetic fallacy, a cheap dramatic effect. He saw the lightning fork across the sky, a brilliant, jagged tear in the darkness, and his only thought was a flicker of concern about a potential power grid failure affecting his stock prices. He was so insulated from the physical world, so protected by his technology, that the raw power of nature seemed like a distant, irrelevant spectacle. He dismissed the storm the same way he dismissed everything he couldn't control, with contempt. His mind was on the kill, the multi-billion-dollar deal, the corporate warfare. He was a predator heading into battle, and the weather was nothing more than a noisy distraction. He strode into his private elevator, the polished doors sealing him off from the roar of the wind. Inside, the world went silent. The storm was reduced to a muted visual display through the elevator's small reinforced window. He watched the city lights smear and flicker below as he began his descent. For a moment, he felt that familiar sense of superiority. He was gliding effortlessly through the heart of the chaos, untouched and untouchable. Down below, I huddled under a small overhang, the tarp over my machines barely holding. The water was already pooling around my ankles, cold and dirty. I watched the lights on the Finch Tower flicker. Once, twice. I felt a strange vibration through the soles of my worn-out sneakers, a deep, resonant tremor that seemed to come from the earth itself. It was more than just the thunder. It was a mechanical shudder, a groan from the heart of the great machine. Then it happened. A bolt of lightning, brighter and more savage than any that had come before, struck the tower's spire. It wasn't a glancing blow. It was a direct hit, a spear of pure energy plunging into the building's heart. The sky went white for a split second, and the thunder that followed was instantaneous and brutal. It was a sound of something breaking. Every light in the Finch Tower and in the surrounding blocks went out. The city was plunged into a sudden, shocking darkness, the only illumination coming from the relentless, strobing flashes of lightning. For a few seconds, there was only the sound of the rain and the wind. The steady, powerful hum of the city had been silenced. A deep, unnatural quiet settled over everything. I felt it in my bones. A deep, sickening lurch. The great machine had just died, and trapped inside its heart was the one man who believed he was its master. For Alistair Finch, the world ended not with a bang, but with a sickening jolt and the abrupt death of light. One moment, he was descending in his silent, climate-controlled cocoon, master of all he surveyed. The next, the elevator shuddered violently, a bone-jarring tremor that threw him against the polished chrome wall. He heard a grinding, metallic scream from somewhere above, a sound of tortured machinery giving up the ghost. Then a final, stomach-lurching drop of about 10 feet, and a dead stop. Absolute, final, and immovable. The soft, recessed lighting vanished, plunging him into a profound darkness. The only thing left was the hum of the emergency systems, which lasted for precisely 1 second before it too died with a pathetic fizzle. Silence. A silence so deep and complete, it felt like a physical weight. The only light was a single, tiny, malevolent red LED on the control panel, casting a hellish glow on his pale, shocked face. His first emotion wasn't fear. It was outrage, a pure, undiluted fury. How dare this happen? His system. His perfect, proprietary billion-dollar system. He straightened his suit, brushing off invisible dust, a man trying to impose order on a situation that had just declared war on it. He stabbed at the control panel. Nothing. The sleek, touch-sensitive screen was as dead as a piece of glass. He pressed the emergency call button. No reassuring ringtone. No voice from a security center. Just the dead, mocking silence. It was a fake button, a placebo for clients who needed the illusion of a safety net. He had always known it was routed through the main system, and the main system was clearly gone. His breath started to quicken. He ran a hand through his perfectly styled hair, his fingers trembling slightly. This wasn't just a power outage. The emergency generators should have kicked in. His elevator, his personal technological marvel, ran on a triple redundant power supply. A city-wide blackout shouldn't have even made it flicker. The lightning strike must have been 1,000 to 1 shot, a direct hit that created a power surge so massive It didn't just trip the breakers, it fried them. It had bypassed the redundancies and burned out the very core of the system's brain. He was not in a stopped elevator. He was in a sealed metal box with its nervous system scorched into oblivion. The gilded cage had slammed shut, and he was the bird inside. He fumbled for his phone. Of course, no signal. The elevator shaft was a Faraday cage by his own design, to prevent electronic eavesdropping. His own obsession with security had now become his prison. He was suspended somewhere between the 60th and 70th floors, 100 stories up, in a box he had built to be impenetrable. He shouted, "Hello, is anyone there?" The sound was swallowed by the insulated walls, thin and pathetic. The master of the universe, a man whose voice could command boardrooms and move markets, was reduced to a desperate cry in the dark. The minutes began to stretch, each one a small lifetime. The fury began to curdle into something else, something cold and unfamiliar. It was the creeping tendrils of genuine fear. He was a man who had solved every problem with a phone call, a bank transfer, or a command. Now all his power, all his wealth was utterly useless. It couldn't penetrate the steel walls. It couldn't reboot a fried circuit. He was trapped by the very thing he worshipped: technology. The flawless, logical, controllable world he had built for himself had turned on him. The silence was no longer peaceful. It was mocking him. The darkness was no longer a comfort. It was a suffocating blanket. He slid down the wall, his expensive suit wrinkling, and sat on the cold floor. The red light on the panel blinked at him, a single, unblinking eye in the void. It was the heartbeat of the monster that had swallowed him whole. Outside, the storm raged on, but inside the box, a different kind of storm was just beginning, and the one person in the world who could hear his silent scream was standing in a puddle, 100 feet below. The minutes inside the elevator bled into one another, a slow, viscous drip of time in the suffocating dark. Alistair Finch, a man whose every second was scheduled and monetized, had lost all sense of it. There was only the before and the now. The red light on the dead panel pulsed with a slow, steady rhythm, a mocking metronome for his rising panic. He tried to control his breathing, to apply the cold logic that had been the cornerstone of his life. Problem: trapped. Objective: escape. Method: unknown. The final word echoed in the chambers of his mind. Unknown. It was a word he despised, a concept he had spent his life eliminating. Now it was the only word that mattered. He stood up and began to pace, the sound of his expensive leather shoes on the metal floor, the only break in the silence. 3 steps one way, a turn, 3 steps back. A caged animal. His mind, usually a whirlwind of strategies and calculations, was a frantic storm of what-ifs. What if the emergency brakes failed? What if the car just dropped? He imagined the fall, a terrifying 10-second plunge into oblivion. He pushed the thought away, but it kept coming back, a vulture circling his sanity. He felt a bead of sweat trace a path down his temple. He, Alistair Finch, did not sweat. Sweating was an admission of weakness, of a loss of control. He angrily wiped it away. He tried shouting again, banging his fist against the door, the sound a dull, unsatisfying thud. "Get me out of here. Do you know who I am?" The question hung in the dead air, a monument to his own irrelevance. The elevator didn't care who he was. His carefully constructed persona was beginning to crumble, flaking away like old paint. The ruthless tycoon, the master strategist, was being replaced by a terrified man in a box. He thought about the board meeting, the billion-dollar deal. It all seemed so laughably insignificant now. What good were billions when you couldn't buy a single breath of fresh air? What good was a corporate empire when you were the sole inhabitant of a 6-by-6-foot kingdom of darkness? The arrogance that had fueled him for decades had been a high-octane gasoline. Now the tank was empty. All that was left were the fumes of fear. He felt for the emergency hatch in the ceiling, his hands patting the smooth, seamless surface. Of course, there was no handle. It was bolted from the outside, another one of his brilliant security features. Impenetrable. He slumped back down to the floor, pulling his knees to his chest. He was a child again, afraid of the dark. The silence was no longer just an absence of sound. It was alive. It was listening to his ragged breaths, to the frantic drumming of his own heart. It was judging him. He thought about all the people he had stepped on to get to the top, the assistants he'd fired, the partners he'd betrayed, the competitors he'd crushed. He had always seen it as a necessary part of the game. Now, In this profound isolation, he saw a parade of their faces in the darkness, their eyes accusing him. He had built a life so insulated that in his moment of greatest need, there was no one to call, no one who would genuinely worry. They would worry about the deal, about the stock price, about the power vacuum. But about him, the man, he wasn't sure. The thought was colder and sharper than the fear of falling. It was the icy terror of absolute loneliness. The king was trapped in his own treasure chest, and the key was nowhere to be found. But 100 stories below, a boy who lived amongst forgotten things was about to notice a single discordant note in the symphony of the storm. While Alistair Finch was being consumed by the silence, I was listening to it. The city's power outage had created a vacuum of sound, and into that vacuum rushed the raw, unfiltered noises of the storm. The howl of the wind, the percussive drumming of the rain, the distant wail of sirens. But I heard something else, or rather, I felt it. It was the absence of a sound I knew better than my own heartbeat. The hum. Every building has a hum, a unique resonant frequency created by its life support systems, the electricity, the ventilation, the plumbing. The Finch Tower's hum was a deep, powerful bass note, a constant presence in the background of my life. And it was gone. The emergency generators had kicked in for the rest of the building. I could see the faint, scattered lights of emergency power in some of the windows, but the deep foundational hum from the main trunk line hadn't returned. The building's heart wasn't beating right. Something was wrong, deeply wrong. Security guards were running around the lobby, their flashlights cutting frantic arcs in the gloom. They were focused on the main power, on rebooting the common systems. They were following their training, their checklists. They were looking at the problem, but they weren't listening to it. I slipped away from my drenched alcove, drawn by an instinct I couldn't explain. I moved along the side of the tower, my small frame invisible in the chaos of the storm. I came to a service entrance where a small group of frantic maintenance workers were gathered around a large external junction panel. They were shouting at each other, rain plastering their hair to their foreheads. They were trying to get the main grid back online. But I wasn't looking at the main panel. My eyes were fixed on a smaller, separate conduit, heavily armored and leading straight up the side of the building. It was labeled P-Evac 01, Private Elevator, Alistair Finch's elevator, and it was dead. Utterly, completely dead. There was no flicker of a service light, no faint electrical buzz. It was a severed limb. While the other systems were in chaos, this one was in a coma. I edged closer, my heart pounding. I could see the scorch marks around the panel's seals, the faint smell of burnt ozone cutting through the rain. A direct hit, a catastrophic surge. I knew, with a certainty that chilled me to the bone, what that meant. A surge that powerful wouldn't just trip a breaker, it would weld it shut. It would flash fry the logic board, turning its delicate silicon pathways into useless glass. And these proprietary systems, especially the high-end ones Mr. Finch would use, they had fail-safes on top of their fail-safes. A total power loss wouldn't just stop the car, it would trigger the emergency magnetic brakes, massive electromagnets that would clamp onto the guide rails with tons of force, locking the car in place. A mechanical lockdown. You couldn't just turn the power back on, you had to manually release it. I saw the whole picture in my mind, a schematic of disaster. He was trapped, not just stuck, but locked in a steel cage, and the key wasn't electrical. It was mechanical, and no one here was looking at the right problem. They were trying to fix a dead brain while the body was in a full-body seizure. I watched them, my mind racing, piecing together the puzzle from the scraps of knowledge I'd hoarded over the years. I thought about the security panel I had fixed, the motor I had rewired, the diagrams I had memorized from discarded manuals. It all clicked into place. I knew somehow I knew how it worked. I had to tell them. I was just a skinny, rain-soaked kid from the Warren. They would never listen, but the image of that dead conduit, of that silent, severed lifeline, pushed me forward. I took a deep breath, the rain and the fear cold on my face, and stepped out of the shadows. I was about to speak a language these men had forgotten, the language the machine was screaming in. "You're wasting your time." The words came out of my mouth before I could stop them, thin and reedy against the roar of the storm. 3 maintenance workers and a beefy security guard turned to look at me. Their expressions were a mixture of annoyance and disbelief. I looked like a drowned rat, a street kid who had wandered in from the deluge. The security guard took a step towards me, his hand raised. "Get out of here, kid. This is a restricted area. Go on, Git. I stood my ground, my heart hammering against my ribs. You're trying to reboot the main power, I said, my voice a little stronger now. It won't work. Not for him. I pointed a trembling finger at the scorched PEVAC-01 panel. That circuit is independent. The surge didn't just trip it. It flash-fried the I/O controller and triggered the maglocks. The men stared at me, blankly. It was as if I had just started speaking ancient Greek. The head of maintenance, a tired-looking man with a mustache, finally scoffed. The what locks? Kid, what do you know about proprietary elevator systems? It was a fair question. What did I know? Only everything I had ever read, everything I had ever taken apart, everything I had ever dreamt about. The magnetic fail-safe brakes, I elaborated, the words tumbling out of me now. They're designed to prevent a fall during total power failure. They clamp onto the rails. You can't reboot the system until the brakes are manually released. It's a physical lock, not an electronic one. You're trying to wake up a computer, but you need to be opening a door with a key. The security guard looked at the maintenance chief, a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. What I was saying, as crazy as it sounded coming from a kid, had the ring of technical truth. The chief, whose name tag read Gus, shook his head. Even if you're right, that's impossible. The release mechanism is in the primary maintenance shaft, halfway up the building, and the system is built to be tamper-proof. He was dismissing me, but he wasn't yelling anymore. He was arguing, which meant he was listening. Tamper-proof from the outside, I shot back, but not from the inside of the shaft. There has to be a manual override, a crank system. It's a safety requirement. I wasn't just guessing. I knew it. A machine without a manual override is a death trap. A designer as paranoid as Finch would demand one. And how would you know that? Gus asked, his voice laced with suspicion. I hesitated. How could I explain my kingdom of scrap? My nights spent reading faded schematics I'd found in dumpsters. I read things, I said lamely. Before he could laugh, the security guard's radio crackled to life. A panicked voice from the control room. Gus, we have nothing. PEVAC-01 is a ghost. The system isn't responding to any diagnostics. It's not just off, it's gone. The engineers from Finch Automations are an hour out, maybe more with this storm. A tense silence fell over the group. An hour. To a man trapped in a dark box, an hour could be an eternity. All eyes turned back to me. I was no longer just a weird kid. I was the only person who had offered a theory that fit the facts. Gus stared at me, his gaze intense. He looked at the dead panel, then back at my face, my earnest, rain-soaked face. He was caught between protocol and desperation. Protocol said to kick me out and wait for the experts. Desperation was looking at the name Alistair Finch on the panel and imagining what would happen to his career if the most powerful man in the city died on his watch. He made a decision. You say there's a crank in the shaft? I nodded, my heart leaping into my throat. Show me, he said, his voice grim. You show me exactly what you're talking about. The security guard looked at him like he'd lost his mind. Gus, you can't be serious. We can't let a kid into the maintenance shaft. Gus turned to him, his face set like concrete. Right now, that kid is the only chance we've got. He turned and motioned for me to follow. I was being led out of the storm and into the belly of the beast, a world of gears and steel I had only ever dreamed of seeing. The maintenance shaft was a different world. It was the Finch Tower's hidden skeleton, a place of raw, functional ugliness that was the complete opposite of the polished marble and glass elsewhere. Gus led me through a series of grey corridors, the air growing colder and smelling of damp concrete and ozone. We finally stopped at a heavy steel door marked Danger High Voltage. Gus unlocked it, and a wave of cool, dark air washed over us. He shone his flashlight into the abyss. It wasn't a room. It was a vertical tunnel, a throat of metal and wires that plunged down into darkness and rose up into nothingness. A narrow steel catwalk clung to one side, a spiderweb of pipes and conduits running alongside it. This was it, the veins of the great machine. My fear was gone, replaced by a surge of pure adrenaline. This was my sanctuary, this was my cathedral. My eyes weren't on the dizzying drop, but on the machinery. I could see the thick armored cables for the elevator, the hydraulic lines, the counterweight systems. It was a symphony of engineering, and I could hear every note. The access point for the manual brake release should be near the car itself, I said, my voice echoing in the vast space. We need to know what floor it's stuck on. Gus spoke into his radio. The reply was tinny and distant. Best guess is somewhere between 65 and 70. My mind raced. Okay, the service access ladder for that section is on level 62. Gus just stared at me. How do you know that? I pointed with my flashlight. The labeling convention on the conduit junctions, they're coded by floor section. We took a rattling service elevator, not much better than a freight lift, up to the 62nd floor. The feeling of ascent was thrilling. When the doors opened, we were in another grey corridor, the roar of the storm more distant here, a low, constant rumble. Gus led me to another steel hatch. "This is it," he said, his voice tight with anxiety. He was putting his entire career in the hands of a teenager in a drenched t-shirt. He opened the hatch, and we were back in the main shaft, but higher up. Far below I could see the faint glint of the maintenance crew's lights. Gus shone his powerful flashlight upwards, and there it was. About 30 feet above us, a dark, motionless shape was wedged in the shaft. The elevator. My heart pounded. It was so close. I started climbing the service ladder, bolted to the wall, my worn sneakers finding easy purchase. Gus followed close behind, his heavy boots clanging on the rungs. "Careful, kid," he grunted, but I felt more at home here than I ever had on solid ground. As we got closer, I could see the full extent of the mechanism. The magnetic brakes were huge clamp-like jaws of black metal locked onto the steel guide rail. They were even bigger than I had imagined, and just as I predicted, tucked behind a service panel on the top of the car was a manual release system. It was a complex array of gears connected to a large socket-like input. It was designed for a special T-bar wrench, a tool the Finch engineers would have. A tool we didn't have. Gus swore under his breath. "It's no good. We need the key." But I wasn't looking at the socket. I was looking at the gears. It was just another puzzle, a bigger, more dangerous puzzle. I pulled a few things from my pockets. A rusty multi-headed screwdriver I had found a year ago. A small wrench I had modified myself. A length of sturdy copper wire. They were my tools, my treasures. Gus looked at my meager collection with despair. "What are you going to do with that junk?" I didn't answer. I was already working, my mind and hands in perfect sync. I used the screwdriver to pry open a small auxiliary gear casing. The internal gears were stiff with disuse. I needed leverage. I wedged the handle of my wrench between two of the larger cogs, creating a makeshift crank. It was awkward, but it gave me a handhold. Now to engage the primary release. I used the copper wire to bypass the electronic lock on the clutch, connecting two terminals directly. A small spark flew, and I heard a satisfying clunk as the gear clutch engaged. I had just hot-wired a billion-dollar elevator. I looked at Gus, my face probably smeared with grease. I gripped the wrench, my knuckles white. "This is going to be loud," I said. It was time to turn the key. My hands were shaking, but not from fear. It was anticipation. I took a deep breath, the metallic smell of the shaft filling my lungs. I put all my weight into the wrench, pushing. The mechanism resisted, frozen by the immense magnetic force and months of disuse. I grunted, my muscles straining. Gus watched, his flashlight beam trembling, a silent, helpless observer. "Come on," I muttered, my teeth gritted. "Come on." I pushed again, harder this time, putting my entire body into it. There was a groan, a deep, protesting shriek of metal on metal that echoed through the entire shaft. It was the sound of a giant waking up. The gears began to move, slowly, painfully. Each inch was a battle. My arms burned, my back ached, but I couldn't stop. I had to free it. Inside the elevator, the sound was terrifying. Alistair Finch, who had been lost in a haze of fear and resignation, was jolted into stark terror. The groan came from right above his head, a sound from a nightmare. The car vibrated, a low, powerful tremor. Was it falling? Was this the end? He scrambled into a corner, bracing for the final plunge, his heart a wild bird thrashing in his chest. He closed his eyes, a lifetime of arrogance and power reduced to a single primal prayer for survival. But it didn't fall. Instead, there was a deafening bang, a cannon shot of releasing pressure. The magnetic brakes, their power severed, disengaged with a violent jolt. The elevator dropped about a foot, a sickening lurch that stole Alistair's breath, and then caught, held by the main cable and the now disengaged emergency system. I nearly lost my grip on the wrench when the brakes released. The sudden lack of resistance sent me stumbling back against the ladder. The elevator was free, but it wasn't moving. "Now what?" Gus yelled over the echoing noise. "The gravity feed. We have to lower it manually." I pointed to a large lever near the main cable drum, covered in warning labels. It was the emergency brake for the cable itself. It would allow a controlled descent. It took both of us to move it. Gus, with his raw strength, and me, guiding him, telling him how much pressure to apply. Slowly, carefully, we began to lower the elevator. Floor by floor, the massive steel box descended, its progress marked by the numbers stenciled on the shaft wall. 70, 69, 68. It was a slow, painstaking process, a two-man operation to pilot the broken machine. Down in the lobby, the security team heard the noise. They looked up at the elevator doors, their faces a mixture of hope and terror. The floor indicator, which had been dead for hours, suddenly flickered to life, powered by the kinetic energy of the descent. 5, 4, 3. A crowd was gathering. The word had spread. Mr. Finch was trapped. The experts were on their way, but something was happening now. 2, 1. With a final, gentle shudder, the elevator came to a stop at the ground floor. For a moment, there was a stunned silence. Then, with a soft chime, the doors, now running on the lobby's emergency power, slid open. The figure that emerged was not the immaculate, powerful Alistair Finch they were used to. This man was a ghost. His billion-dollar suit was wrinkled and disheveled. His hair was a mess. His face was pale, his eyes wide with the trauma of his ordeal. He stumbled forward, blinking in the light of the flashlights. A man returning from the dead. He looked at the faces of his security team, his maintenance crew, and then his eyes fell on me. I was standing beside Gus, covered in grease, my clothes still damp, holding my rusty wrench like it was a scepter. I was just a boy, a poor boy from the wrong side of the tracks. He looked at my face, then at my hands, still stained with the grit and oil of his salvation. The whole lobby was silent, witnessing the impossible. The king had been saved, but not by an army of his own men, not by an expert in a suit. His entire world had been put back on its axis by a junk boy with a rusty wrench and a love for broken things. Alistair Finch stood there, swaying slightly, his gaze locked on me. In his world, problems were solved by men with advanced degrees and expensive toolkits. Solutions came with invoices and non-disclosure agreements. He looked at my worn-out sneakers, my cheap t-shirt, and the makeshift tools still in my hand. His mind, a machine of logic and value assessment, struggled to compute what it was seeing. It was like trying to run advanced calculus on a broken abacus. The situation did not compute. All his life, he had equated value with price. He had just been saved by someone who, in his ledger book of a worldview, had a value of 0. The debt he felt in that moment was staggering, and it had no price tag. It was a debt of life, of sanity, a debt that his billions couldn't begin to repay. He took a step forward, his voice hoarse and cracked. "You," he said, the single word cutting through the silence of the lobby. "It was you?" Gus stepped forward protectively. "Sir, the boy's name is Leo. He's the one who figured it out." He hot-wired the release. Alistair's eyes never left mine. He wasn't seeing a hero. He was seeing an anomaly, a glitch in his reality that was forcing a system-wide reboot of his entire philosophy. He saw the intelligence in my eyes, the quiet confidence of someone who understands how things work, not just how to buy them. He, the great Alistair Finch, the master of technology, had been trapped by his own creation. And this boy, this junk boy from the Warren, had walked into the heart of the machine and tamed it. He didn't do what everyone expected. He didn't pull out a checkbook. He didn't offer a cash reward. He did something far more profound. He looked at me, and for the first time in his life, he truly saw someone. He saw not a poor kid, but a mind, a brilliant, raw, untamed mind. He saw the same spark of passion he must have had as a young man before it had been buried under layers of wealth and cynicism. "How did you know?" he asked, his voice softer now. "How did you know about the magnetic locks?" I swallowed hard, the attention of all these adults unnerving me. "I like to take things apart," I said quietly. "Radios, toasters, anything with wires. I read the manuals when I can find them. I just understood how it had to work." A slow smile spread across Alistair Finch's face. It was an unfamiliar expression, one that seemed to crack the marble mask he usually wore. He had spent his life searching for the next great innovation, the next brilliant engineer, looking for them in the halls of MIT and Stanford. And here one was, standing in his lobby, covered in grease. He had been looking through a telescope when the biggest star had fallen right in his own backyard. The storm outside was finally starting to subside, the rain softening to a drizzle. It felt like the world was breathing a sigh of relief. Alistair Finch turned to Gus. "Get this boy a change of clothes and find his family. From now on, his education is my responsibility. All of it. The best schools, the best tutors. I want him in my R&D department the second he is ready." Then he turned back to me. "Leo," he said, testing the name on his tongue, "you don't just love machines, you understand them. I build cages. I want you to teach me how to build wings instead." That day, 2 lives were saved in that elevator shaft. Alistair Finch was saved from a prison of steel, but I believe he was also saved from a prison of his own making, a gilded cage of loneliness and arrogance. And me? I was saved from a life of being overlooked. I was given a key not to an elevator, but to a future I had only dared to dream about in my kingdom of discarded things. I learned that day that the biggest machines aren't made of steel and wire, they're made of people and perceptions. And sometimes, the only thing needed to fix a broken system is for someone to look at the world in a different way. The man who lived in the sky had been brought back to Earth, and the boy who lived on the ground was finally being given a chance to fly. If this story touched you, don't forget to like, comment your thoughts, and subscribe for more powerful life lessons every week.